Hello, I'm Nathan P. Butler, author of a Saga on home video and host from the Star Wars Home Video Library here on YouTube, and this is Star Wars Home Video Year by Year. This time we take a look at 1983. And let me say up front, I apologize if my throat is a little bit scratchy, if I feel a little bit breathy here or sound a little bit breathy. I have been sick for a little bit, but finally bouncing back and trying to get more of these episodes done because we're really kind of building up a nice head of steam here, so to speak, with those first episodes. So I want to keep that going. So now we're taking a look at 1983. Last episode was a huge one. 1982, lots of new Star Wars home video releases because that's the year that A New Hope finally hit home video at all, in its full form. But 1983 is pretty big in Star Wars as well, of course, because it's the year that Return of the Jedi first hit theaters. Now, with Return of the Jedi hitting theaters, it does mean that the original trilogy is effectively done at this point, and it's going to be quite a while before any more Star Wars films hit American theaters. We will see that the Ewok films actually hit theaters overseas, but not over here. In context, this year is also noteworthy for a few other things beyond home video. First of all, we had the Lando trilogy of novels, the Lando Adventures, being released throughout 1983, and that is key. I've talked a little bit about Star Wars novels on here before, Star Wars comics as well. That is not what this series is all about. If you want to learn more about that, my Star Wars Timeline Gold, which I did all the way up from 1997 until 2018, is still available at StarWarsFanWars.com/timeline. And if you want to know about the timeline of releases, at least up to that point, you can check out the appendix document where there's a real-life release calendar on there. If you want to look at some of the early stuff about Star Wars home video and you don't cringe at horrible video quality, check out my series From the Star Wars Library with no home video in there here on this channel. I covered everything in publication order, basically from initial release all the way up through around the mid-1990s, right around the time that I took a hiatus from that because the reboot was happening and all. But I don't really touch on those books much because there's no sense in listing everything that's released every single year. However, it's key here to note that once the Lando trilogy is done in 1983, there will be no new Star Wars novels until 1991. Getting out of 83 is going to lead us into the beginnings of a poorly named so-called dark times for Star Wars, which really only lasted, if you talk about just original Star Wars stories being produced, more like 3 years if you ignore the RPG, 1988 to 1991. But it's often exaggerated in its impact because certain things like films and novels didn't see new releases for quite a while. In this case, novels and films both ending in 83. With films, it won't happen again until the special editions in 97, and of course with novels, not until Heir to the Empire in 91. But there's other product lines that are still going at this point and will continue for a while. But that's the first of sort of the dying off bits. No new more Star Wars films after this point for a while, no new Star Wars novels again for a while. This is, however, also the first time that we saw an original Star Wars audio drama being released. In 1981, we had seen the NPR radio dramatization of A New Hope. We would eventually see those for Empire and much later for Return of the Jedi. But Rebel Mission to Ord Mantell was an original story released on LP in 1983. I'm particularly partial to that because I spent a long time in the Star Wars fan audio community doing stories like Second Strike, Nothing Changes, Always in Motion, Ambush on Ankara, and so on. But also of note, as someone who did that aforementioned Star Wars Timeline Gold for about 20 years or so, chronicling the saga of Star Wars in comic and novel and film and every other form just about, this is also the year that saw the first post-Return of the Jedi story ever produced for Star Wars. It was in the Marvel Comics, and it was the story Jawas of Doom. So it's sort of a weird period here. What's also noteworthy as we head into looking at home viewing is that there were no Super 8 releases in the US for Return of the Jedi. We would see some in other regions, particularly full versions of the film from Tehran. We don't see that in the US in 83 at all. Instead, the focus is still in the US on those main 4 great format war formats: VHS, Beta, LaserDisc, and CED. So let's take a look at where things stood in 83. Well, as we saw last time, rebranding was happening as 20th Century Fox Video gave way to CBS Fox Video. We already saw a change happen near the end of the year where the CED of A New Hope was re-released with the CBS Fox Video branding. That rebranding continued into 83 for the other formats and even sort of circled around to some degree, you could say, to CED. So we'd originally had the 82 version of the VHS from 20th Century Fox Video for A New Hope. That was supplanted by this version. CBS Fox Video, similar packaging though, still a drawer case, little red stripe here saying stereo mono compatible. Easy to recognize as being from '83 because it is a CBS Fox Video version and it is that wide drawer case. We saw the same thing as we went from the 1982 beta version to the 1983 beta version, which at this point bears a sticker showing beta on the cover, covering up the little red stripe. I would note, by the way, that the CBS Fox versions completely do away with the serial number stuff. LaserDisc was also impacted. We had our 1982 version with that heavy branding up here on the top, just like you saw with those other ones, that sort of striped branding with the company logo here in the center. A little bit of a cleaner look as we get the version in 1983 that gets rid of the bar and gives us just CBS Fox Video. And then, oddly enough, CED saw another reissue of A New Hope, but they had already gone to this version that we saw last time, where the branding at the top had changed to just a little corner with CBS Fox Video. So how could this possibly have changed? Well, CED did not last very long as a format, and the further along you get, the less you see the sort of, we're going to use blue for stereo, white for mono rule actually being held to. It was as if they were just kind of using whatever parts were available at different times. And we also saw slight differences in the way that the caddies themselves were designed. So in 1983, we got this third version of A New Hope on CED. You'll notice here a couple of things. First off, this is just flat. There is no notch as a handle. Remember, the way that these worked, this is the end of '82 version, is you would put it in the player, pull it out, the frame and the disc would stay inside and play, then when you were done, stick it in, grab it, pull it back out. So this handle was nice and convenient to help you do that. Well, in the 1983 version, the handle is gone. Moreover, you'll notice here, and we see this on pretty much every single one of these from '83, for whatever reason, again, probably supply issues, because they're just not really a well-regarded format, they were already kind of sort of winding down slowly but surely, we would see a white frame on the blue caddy for the 1983 version of A New Hope. We would see something similar with The Empire Strikes Back the following year. So this is not something where somebody just screwed up and mixed up the frame and the caddy. This was what the '83 version actually looked like. Mismatched colors. Now, before we move on to look at two other quick things for 1983, let me make a note here that I thought maybe went without saying, but I guess I should actually say it out loud. In 1982, and here in 1983, when we are getting full versions of A New Hope on home video, these are full screen, pan and scan versions of the film. In other words, the film is in widescreen in theaters, and it is cut down to a screen size to fit on a regular 4x3 television of the '80s era, and shortly thereafter, of course, as well, but cut down through a pan and scan technique of basically taking shots of the individual frames and whatnot to sort of cut down the width here. So if you play these on a regular television back then, you would have yourself a full image, regardless of whether you're looking at height or width. It would still be a while until we got widescreen versions at home, actually starting in Japan in a little while. It's just worth noting that. So if someone was looking for a theatrical experience, you really wouldn't get it from any of these early versions because they were full screen, they were pan and scan, they were missing about a third of the picture thanks to being full screen instead of widescreen. Just thought I'd mention that, thought it might be obvious given the era, but maybe not. So since I didn't mention it last episode, I thought I'd mention it this episode. Speaking of 1983, though, there are two other things of note, and I'm kind of torn on which one to look at first because one jumps us out of the country and one jumps us to something weird. Let's jump out of the country first, and that is to Japan. I mentioned before that there are sometimes format war formats in a particular era that actually aren't available in a particular region. We already looked at V2000 that had no releases in the US at all. Well, in Japan, we had another format that didn't catch on in the US at all. There was essentially an Asian format, primarily in Japan, which is VHD, or Video High Density Discs. They're kind of like a CED in that they are vinyl discs, but they read differently. And in the case of Japan, they didn't time compress the films, which meant that if each side, as in the case with CED, basically had an hour to fit on either side, they actually needed 2 discs to fit the entirety of A New Hope. And boy, did that mean a lot of bulk to this release out of Japan. This is the Japanese VHD 1983 release of A New Hope. Nope, wait, excuse me. This is that release. Yes, in order to have 2 discs for a VHD in Japan, most of the time for Star Wars, with the exception of Return of the Jedi, we would wind up seeing 2 different products, so to speak, packaged effectively together. A VHD, and we'll look at, I guess, number 1 here, it doesn't really matter, looks, again, very much like a CED. It is narrower, of course, kind of looks like a computer disc of the time, one of those harder package floppies rather than the old black floppy floppies. So this is the 1983 VHD of A New Hope, or at least disc 1 of A New Hope. Actually, getting them out is quite a pain in the ass, but here is an actual VCD, which probably means nothing if I don't compare it in size to a CED. So as a point of comparison, here is a CED. If I put them here with the same center, you can tell that there is a significant difference, basically 9.8 inches versus 11.8 inches in terms of diameter for VHD and CED respectively. I'd also note that while that CED had that nice frame that goes all the way around the disc to help it in and out, a VHD's frame is just this thing that just kind of gets snapped into the top and closes it. Lastly, for 1983, we have an oddball item. We are not going to cover this type of thing much, if at all, here in this series, but this one is particularly noteworthy. One of the other types of things you might collect if you're a Star Wars home video collector is not just official Star Wars releases, but related stuff such as documentaries or parodies. Things made outside of the standard Star Wars fare that is still, however, related to Star Wars in some way. Spaceballs is a big part of a lot of Star Wars home video collections. But there's one early fan film that is considered to be sort of the seminal parody fan film for Star Wars. It sort of sets the stage for all that will come. It's known as Hardware Wars. And yes, in 1983, there was actually an official release of Hardware Wars and other film farces on VHS in the US. I would assume there's probably a beta release as well. I haven't seen it myself, but yeah, Hardware Wars actually got a release before The Empire Strikes Back did. That won't come until the following year. But that means we're ready to wrap up this year and look ahead to next time taking a look at 1984.